The date is 19th May 2019, and Shyam Saran Negi, a 102-year-old ex-school teacher, is on his way to cast his vote in the 2019 Lok Sabha elections. Despite failing vision and aching knees, just as he has done for every election prior. But what's more amazing about this man is that in October 1951, Mr. Negi was the first person in all of independent India to cast his vote in India's first general elections.
What follows here is the record of such a people, the people of our nation who played a worthy, active part in a great experiment, the experiment of free India's first general election.
Before we get into the topic of India's first general elections, let's understand how we got here. For over 200 years prior to its independence, India was under British rule. Like all European colonialists, they came to the subcontinent to trade at first, and then began to wage a series of wars against the local kings. Eventually, they gained control of the country and its affairs. Driven by the need to profit rather than to help the local population, the British plundered the country economically for centuries, and they were responsible for countless deaths through famines and wars. However, in the process, they introduced changes which involuntarily united the country, such as a system of railways which brought together people from different parts of the country, and a liberal medium of education, which introduced new ideas of liberty and individual rights. These were new concepts in a society where privileges were based on one's birth into a community. There were attempts made by the Indians to revolt against the British. In 1857, for example, the sepoys in the British Army tried to do so violently. But they were crushed by the British in what was known as the First War of Independence. Fast forward to 1885, where a retired civil servant, Alan Octavian Hume, established the Indian National Congress as an avenue for urban middle-class intellectuals from different parts of the country to collectively voice their concerns against the British. These intellectuals, who had been educated in the novel ideas of liberty, equality, and in some cases studied and visited England, noticed that their own countrymen were being denied their most basic rights. So they decided to take these messages throughout India to unite a divided country under a common banner and goal, which was freedom from the British Raj. The Indian National Congress soon developed into a mass movement, with many young radical leaders like Jawaharlal Nehru, Sardar Patel, and Subhash Chandra Bose. They were led by Mahatma Gandhi with non-violent agitations, which crippled the British Indian government. Throughout the first part of the 20th century, members of the Indian National Congress held a series of non-cooperation movements or civil disobedience, which at times brought the Raj to its knees. The British were forced to grant concessions to the Indians, with legislations such as the Government of India Act of 1919 and the Government of India Act of 1935. However, these measures failed to satisfy the Indians, who soon demanded complete freedom from the British. After the Second World War, the British, who were economically crippled, decided to grant India independence on August 15, 1947. The country was divided into Muslim-majority Pakistan, led by Muhammad Ali Jinnah, and Hindu-majority India, which was headed by an interim government led by Jawaharlal Nehru.
At the stroke of the midnight hour, when the world is sleeping, India will awake to life and freedom.
This government then worked on developing India's constitution and defined how India's elections would work. The Indians who were at the forefront of the freedom struggle were now drafting its constitution, like Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who would become India's first law minister. India would have a parliamentary democracy, which meant that multiple candidates from a particular constituency would contest, and the man or woman with the highest number of votes would be the winner. The constitution was drafted and came into effect on 26th November 1949, and now it was time for India to have its first parliamentary elections, so that the country could finally elect its own leader after centuries of oppression.
Democracy was on trial. Democracy was on trial. And our many millions were the jury.
Carrying out an election for a country of 360 million people who had never tasted freedom in their lifetime was not going to be an easy task. Elections were to be held in 1951, and they would be coordinated by the Independent Election Commission, which was headed by a Bengali civil servant, Sukumar Sen. Sen had an immense task on his hands, and in his own words, described it as the biggest experiment of democracy in human history. Sen was responsible for the election of 489 representatives into parliament, and over 3,000 seats in the 26 different state assemblies, for which he was paid a salary of 4,000 rupees. And Sen volunteered a cut of 500 rupees back to the election commission. The first major task for Sen was to register all 173 million eligible voters in the country. The constitution had allowed for anyone over the age of 21, irrespective of caste, creed, or sex, to be eligible to vote, which was a big deal for a country that was divided into various castes, with lower castes essentially being considered subhuman. Even women were given the power to exercise their franchise, which Western democracies hadn't adopted into their elections until much later. Although given power of the vote on paper, women were held back by many social customs that chained them to the past. In some cases where women tried to register, instead of using their own name, they registered themselves as wife of A or daughter of B, which did not sit well with Sukumar Sen. He ordered for them to re-register or to be struck off the voters list entirely, which led to the omission of 2.8 million women voters. Sen was outraged by the practice, describing it as a curious, senseless relic of the past that did not provide women with their own identity.
The aims and ideals that became reality on our attaining independence were well expressed through the Adult Franchise Clause.
The second major task for Sen was the issue of illiteracy. 85% of the population were unable to read or write, but now they had the power to choose a representative. So as a workaround, Sen decided to use ballot boxes with the party symbol of the candidate pasted on the box, and the voter would drop his or her ballot into the box of their choice. 12 lakh ballot boxes were made for this massive undertaking, and they were distributed all across the country. India spans about 1 million square miles, and officials had to travel to places they had never even dreamt of visiting, by boat or on mule, knowing that they might not return after their duty.
The ballot box, sacred symbol of democracy.
Most parts of early 1951 were spent conducting mock election drills to educate people as well as the officials of the nuances of voting. Sen made sure to visit at least one polling rehearsal in every state. Films explaining the process of voting were also screened in theatres across the country. The elections were to be held in 68 phases over 5 months, which added to the magnitude of the task at hand. To ensure there were no mishaps and smooth voting, the Election Commission hired 2 lakh policemen and 50,000 presiding officers. As the preparations for the elections were taking place, political parties wasted no time in campaigning. Candidates of all ideologies travelled throughout the country canvassing for their party, be it Nehru of the Secular Congress Party, S.P. Mukherjee of the Conservative Jansangh, or even the communists, who had ironically abandoned the idea of revolution to take part in democratic politics. Posters and emblems were everywhere as people campaigned for a wide audience, even to the extent that in Calcutta, there was a stray cow which had "Vote Congress" written on it in Bengali. Finally, on 25th October 1951, in the Chini district of Himachal Pradesh, a young Shamsaran Negi casts the very first vote in the elections, and thus sets in motion the wheels of democracy for an infant country but an ancient civilization. People of all walks of life came to the booth as equals to vote. In Orissa, the local tribesmen came to the polling station with bows and arrows strapped around their bodies. In Bengal, a 110-year-old man was carried to the booth by his 2 grandsons. In Hyderabad, a state that was liberated by the Indian Army from the Nizam's rule, saw the Nizam himself as one of the first people to vote. India's biggest experiment was underway. Polling ended in February 1952. About 60% of the eligible voters exercised their franchise, with Kottayam in Kerala receiving 80% of turnout.
The largest democratic elections in world history were an unparalleled success.
The results of the election did not surprise too many, as the Congress party dominated by winning 364 seats and 45% of the vote share. Jawaharlal Nehru became the first elected Prime Minister of independent India. Some prominent leaders who were at the forefront of the national movement were humbled, like the father of the Constitution, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar, who lost to an obscure milkman named Kajrolkar of the Congress. After the latter's victory, a Marathi journalist popularized the slogan which Ambedkar wouldn't have been too pleased to hear.
कुठे तो घटनाकर आंबेडकर आणि कुठे हा लोणी विक्या कजरोलकर.
Which, when roughly translated, means where is the constitution maker Ambedkar and where the butter seller Kajrolkar? 9 years after the election, Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World, declared, "When Nehru goes, the government will become a military dictatorship." As in so many of the newly independent states, for the army seems to be the only highly organized center of power. On April 11, 2019, Shyam Saran Negi and the rest of India went to vote in the 17th parliamentary elections, with the highest ever voter turnout at 67% of 911 million eligible voters.
In conclusion, the chief credit for this noble undertaking goes to our people, whose multi-million voices have always the ready answer to what's good and bad in government. We are as yet too near the scheme of things to judge the lasting results of this great experiment. That is best left to posterity. But if posterity were to judge whether the part our people played in the great experiment has been fitting and worthwhile, it can be acclaimed in a single word, and that word is yes.